Bueno, pues bienvenidos sean todos a este recinto del Instituto de Geografía. Agradecemos que nos reciba el instituto aquí en este seminario, en la segunda sesión del seminario permanente de Paisaje y Geografía Cultural. También agradecemos al doctor Narciso Barnen Basols su presencia. Ya lo vaya. Em, Él es un experto en temas como este, desde luego desde la perspectiva de México. Es geógrafo y antropólogo. Trabaja, por favor, si me equivoco, me corrige. En la Unidad Ambiental de Querétaro. ¿Sí? Ah, en la Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro, en la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Le damos una cordial bienvenida. Como les advirtió el doctor Federico Fernández, estará haciendo un diálogo, discusión con el doctor Olwig, con base en algunas dudas que incluso el doctor Olwig querría plantear. Bueno, pues les voy a leer a manera de presentación un breve escrito que tengo. Kenneth Olwig nació en Nueva York. Es profesor emérito por la Universidad de Alnarp, Suecia, en el Departamento de Planeación y Gestión del Paisaje. Él se considera un geógrafo del paisaje con un interés particular en las palabras y la literatura. Tiene una maestría en filología de la Universidad de Minnesota. Aquí fue en donde se volvió un estudioso de la filología nórdica, que combina el estudio de la lengua, literatura, historia y geografía. Y de ahí, naturalmente, se transfirió al departamento de geografía, en donde estudió con G. Tuan, quien dirigió su tesis doctoral, y con David Lowenthal. Como producto de este trabajo, escribió el libro Nature's Ideological Landscape, a Literary and Geographic Perspective on its Development and Preservation on Denmark's Jutland Heath, editado por Dennis Cosgrove en 1984. Una combinación de aproximaciones estéticas, legales, literarias, lingüísticas y geográficas culturales caracterizan su aproximación al paisaje y las relaciones entre sociedad y paisaje. Sus intereses transitan del efecto de la percepción cultural de la naturaleza y el paisaje en el desarrollo regional al rol de las ideas de leyes y justicia, dando forma al paisaje político y sus manifestaciones físicas. Este interés lo ha llevado a participar como investigador asociado en diferentes seminarios de investigación en varias instituciones. Fue investigador asociado en Hombre y Naturaleza, Centro de Investigaciones en Humanidades de la Universidad de Odense. Aquí trabajó junto con Coros Gove. También participó como investigador asociado en el seminario Reinventando la Naturaleza, dirigido por William Cronon, en el Instituto de Investigaciones de las Humanidades en la Universidad de California. De aquí surgió el escrito Reinventing Common Nature, Yosemite and Mount Rushmore, a Meandering Tale of Double Nature, para el libro On Common Grounds Toward Reinventing Nature, editado por William Cronon. Este trabajo derivó en la publicación de su libro Landscape, Nature and the Body Politic, From Britain's Renaissance to America's New World, en 2002, en donde explora la noción de paisaje como lugar en contraste con la idea de paisaje como espacio escénico. Fue fundador de una serie de seminarios en estudios nórdicos con el apoyo de Ulf Sporrong, geógrafo de la Universidad de Estocolmo. Este trabajo colaborativo derivó en la publicación del libro Nordic Landscapes, Region and Belonging on the Northern Edge of Europe, editado por su colega Michael Jones en el 2008. La cercana relación de trabajo con Jones también lo llevó a participar en el seminario Landscape Law and Justice que Jones dirigió en el Centro Noruego de Estudios Avanzados de la Academia Noruega de Ciencias en Oslo. Ahí entró en contacto con Don Mitchell, con quien editó el libro Justice, Power and the Political Landscape en 2008. Recientemente ha trabajado con Thomas Germundsson, encabezando la red de investigación del paisaje nórdico, que está afiliada a la red base Grupo de Investigación del Paisaje en el Reino Unido, del cual fue presidente en 2005 y es miembro externo. Este trabajo ha derivado en varias publicaciones, entre ellas un número especial de la revista Landscape Research, Reassessing Landscape Drivers in the Globalist Environmental Agenda, 2010. Tuvo una relación de trabajo con la Junta Directiva del Patrimonio Sueco con relación a la implementación de la Convención Europea del Paisaje. en donde lideró un proyecto de investigación llamado la Convención Europea del Paisaje, una puerta a la planeación e interpretación de la diversidad natural y cultural del patrimonio regional del paisaje. Escribió el artículo The Practice of Landscape Conventions and a Just Landscape, The Case of the European Landscape Convention en el 2007. Actualmente encabeza un proyecto fundado por la Agencia Sueca de Fondos para el Medio Ambiente llamado Landscape Diversity in the Nature-Culture Divide, Landscape Character Analysis, Designated Areas and the Problem of Scalar Insularity in Spatial Landscape Planning. La plática de hoy se titula The Invisible Landscape of Custom, Commons and Community versus the Visible Landscape of the Colonial State. Bienvenido. Welcome.
Not sure what you said, but some of it sounded familiar. Uh, yeah, I've more or less changed the title just a little bit to make it maybe a little more unclear. But some of you heard me speak yesterday. I'm going to follow some of the same thoughts as yesterday, but I'm going to be looking at it more from a geographical perspective as opposed to a landscape architecture perspective. So the first part of this, there's two parts, and the first part is the substantive landscape of place and chorus. The Athenian Pnyx, this area that you see here on Philippo Hill in Athens, was not characterized by geometric architecture like the enclosed, unapproachable space of the Acropolis, where the priesthood was, but rather it was open like this. And this was the place. It was probably a grazed open commons, a place where animals grazed. What's a commons in Spanish? Comunes. Comunes. And as with the word common, communis, it's also the people are a community. It's the root of community. So it's important for that concept. And it was accessible to the populace, and it was the place of the Athenian ecclesia, which was the representative assembly where people could come and talk and make their points made. So it was a democratic place as opposed to the Acropolis. And it's been preserved to this day as a park. It's lacking in monumental buildings compared to the Acropolis. So it's virtually invisible. How many of you have heard of the Acropolis? Everyone, right? How many of you have heard of the Pnyx? One person. Very well educated person. Yeah, so it's sort of invisible. And I didn't know it was there until I stumbled on it. And it just, once you're there, you realize this is a very interesting place, but you don't notice it. Now, an important thing that I'm going to be talking about is that according to Aristotle, and I agree with Aristotle, there are two kinds of political justice, the natural and the conventional. Conventional being customary. What's custom in Spanish? Natural justice has the same force everywhere, and it does not depend upon its being agreed upon or not. Now, this word natural is one of the most difficult words in any language, including Spanish. Now, natural, as he's using it, refers to something like a natural law of physics. It applies everywhere. If I jump off the stage, I'll fall at the same speed as I would here, as I would in Denmark. So that's a natural law. So this kind of geometric shape was considered to be natural. And up until the age of the Enlightenment, up until the 1700s, natural more meant this kind of thing, like geometry, than it meant this kind of thing, which is what you probably think is natural. Custom, so natural law, like Roman law, would apply everywhere within the Roman Empire, for example. But when if the Romans made an agreement with the people that another group of people, and said, okay, if you join the Roman Empire, you can keep your customs as long as you obey the larger Roman law. So customary law was more specific to places. And it may be like this in Mexico. I don't know. Maybe the state has certain kinds of laws that apply everywhere, but maybe the different state of Mexico, but then the states within Mexico may have slightly different customs. Maybe you do things differently there than you do in another state. So custom is conventional justice. And Aristotle says that conventional justice is justice whose provisions are originally indifferent, but once these have been established, they are important. So what this means is, I don't know, maybe a customary thing would be, what side of the road do you drive on? And they drive on one side, and here they drive on another side. Well, it doesn't really matter what side of the road you drive on. But once it's been established, it's very important, because what happens if people drive, you have collisions all over the place. Sometimes it looks here like people drive on that way, but it's because I'm not used to the driving here. I think that this happens. But anyway, and what happens is you have custom, and custom is not usually something you think about. So in Mexico, you do certain things in a certain way, and you take it for granted. For example, say if you're in Rome and it's a big highway and you walk across it, the cars will kind of stop and let you walk across. Don't try that in Mexico City. So, but you all know that. But as a visitor, if you come flying in from Rome, you walk out in front of the first car and then straight to the hospital. So the point is that custom is something that's unspoken of. It's just what you do. But if there is a conflict, like what side of the road do you drive on, then you go to a court and the judge will say, okay, and they'll maybe have a meeting about this, and you'll say, well, from now on, you drive on this side of the road or that side of the road. So what Aristotle is saying, it doesn't really matter in the beginning what it is, but then it becomes important. It sets a precedence. That's the way we do things. And that's important because it's your identity in a lot of ways. The way you do things that's somehow different in Chiapas or here, it means that you feel you're home, that you, I don't know what differently, but something. So this is the basic point. You have kind of a place where customary law was established. People would discuss things and they'd say, here in Athens, we do it this way. But up here, you have the people, the priests, who know about geometry, and they're making laws that apply everywhere. I can give an example of this, that in Scandinavia, before it was Christianized, they had laws that said if you murder somebody out in the field, then you have to pay a fine to the family of the murdered person. But that fine is smaller than if you murder that person in their house, or if you rob their house. If you rob them out in the countryside, it's one thing. If you rob them in their house, it's another thing. Also, if you have an affair with the person's wife out in the field or in the house, it's two different things. So you see that it's not, but when the Catholics came, when the Christians came, they said murder is wrong. No discussion. So you get this kind of judgment. Murder is wrong, and it doesn't matter where it is, and it doesn't matter whether it happens in the field or in your house. It's wrong. So the Pnyx has an odd resemblance with its Speaker's Rock to the Thing Meadow in Iceland, which was the first parliament really in Northern Europe anyway. And these landscape, as they were called, polity of Iceland, they would meet here and discuss things more or less the same way as they would do on the Pnyx. And it's like the same, it doesn't really have any monuments. There's nothing there permanent. There's nothing monumental. It's not at all like the Acropolis. So it's invisible in a way. Now, another thing that's interesting about these things is that the Acropolis is indoors, closed in, and the Pnyx is outdoors. And that seems to make sense in Athens. A lot of people meeting, it would be nice it's outdoors. They have good weather like you have here. But they even met outdoors in Scandinavia, where we have lousy weather a lot of the time. It's raining, it's cold, but they still preferred to be outdoors. Because then everybody could be there. Nobody could control it. Nobody can close the doors and kill everybody who's in the room. That happens. This happened historically. Also, it wasn't written, the Scandinavian laws were not written down. They were memorized. There was a law speaker who had to memorize them, but everyone else who had a fairly good memory could memorize them. The minute you write it down, then you get lawyers, the ones who interpret the text, and then you get it a whole complicated system. We have to pay this lawyer to say things. But if everybody knows the law and remembers it, then it's not a problem. So that's very important, what's going on here. And Heidegger, in an article called The Thing, this is in Scandinavia or in Germany, this kind of institution was called a thing. Res publica. Res means thing in Latin. And the original word, meaning of the word thing, was not this kind of thing or that kind of thing. It was the meeting where you discussed things and then determined what they were, what they meant, what they were valued as, whether murder in the field was better or worse than murder in the house. So uh, Heidegger says in this article, the Romans called a matter for discourse res. The Greek airo, so on, means to speak about something, to deliberate on it. Res publica means not the state, but that which is known to everyone, concerns everybody, and is therefore deliberated in public. And I think this concept of res publica is really interesting. It's the basis basically for the idea of the republic. You have a republic, that's the res publica. You have a monarchy, that's something different. That's the king talking down. The republic is from the bottom up. And this concept of res publica, I think, is interesting. Everybody knows, but doesn't have to be written down. And I think there are certain things you probably know, everyone knows here, but never needs to get written down. And I don't know, it's something that strikes me is that not that many years ago, you'd go into any restaurant or anywhere and people would be smoking away and you could hardly breathe. And all of a sudden, all over the world, people are outside smoking and no one's indoors smoking anymore. And how this happened, I don't know. It's a kind of res publica. And trying to explain this, Gabriella kind of told me the story. And then they gave me this wonderful, beautiful, and heavy book about the campus here. And you can see this is the architect's drawing. And you notice that they have these nice big open squares and these two lonely people standing there. And the interesting about those people, they don't have heads. I don't know why that is. But anyway, this part is really visible and this part is invisible, basically. There's nothing happening here. And it's a bit like the Ponentes. Now, I don't know about this particular building, but at most universities, the administrative staff, the big-time administrators, they sit up at the highest top in the best offices with the best view. And nobody ever really sees them or anything. They come in their limousines and disappear. And if they ask you to come to a meeting, you come to the meeting, that sort of thing. And this is all invisible. And then, but actually what happened was that the students turned these spaces into places to play soccer or football, something else. And it was also places for demonstrations, which was not at all what they wanted when they planned this university. It was supposed to be, you were all supposed to be totally planned. And, and this whole idea, this structure, the cover of this book, that's from a book called by Hobbes called Leviathan. You know about this book? It's sort of the first book that established the theory of the state. And this guy is the state, and that's the head of the state. And if you can't really see it here, I guess, but all these little scales or these little things, there are actually people, little people, and that's the body politic. So you have the body and the body politic. And this state has the sword in one hand, the military, and the church in the other. And that's interesting that this is a shepherd's staff, a stylized shepherd's staff. And it's interesting that in this illustration, you have the state up on a mountain looking down, and then you have the people down below in the landscape, the visual landscape. And this, you see this structure lots of places. So like in Copenhagen, the city government is in this building that looks a lot like a fortress. But out here is where we have our demonstrations and the people can come and deal with the res publica. So you have this kind of parallel structure between on one hand, the kind of power, and on the other, one kind of power, the top-down power, and the bottom-up power, as it were. And I don't know. I came here to ask some questions about this. But it would seem that the Spanish conquerors saw this relationship somewhat in this light, insofar as they placed, for example, the church of yeah, uh, on the top of an ancient pyramid of Cholula, which is overlooking this landscape, a political landscape of a community. So here you have the remains of the pyramid, and then you have the church on top. So the church, you see Leviathan with the sword and the church symbol in the other hand on the top of the hill. So you see the same kind of structure. And I wonder if the Spanish weren't actually thinking in much the same way when they came and colonized, conquered Mexico. And this is a more difficult question. I wonder if the same sort of relation might have existed in pre-conquest Mexico between, for example, the site of Monte Alban's priesthood near Oaxaca and the more invisible places where common communities constituting substantive landscapes might have assembled and organized. Substantive means real rather than apparent, creating and defining rights and duties. So the point then is that uh, very many societies have this. You have this law coming down on what you're supposed to do. You have your traffic regulations. You're supposed to do this and you're supposed to do that. But nobody does it. They all do something else. And everybody knows what everybody does. So it works. But you have these two systems that don't quite juxtapose. I think the most dramatic and perhaps negative example of this is a prison. You have prison guards. You have bars. You have guys with machine guns. You have electric fences. But who runs a prison? Some big man in the prison who has a customary law, who adjudicates, who does things, and he runs the prison, not the prison guards or the state. And so the prison guards have to negotiate with this guy if they want to have peace and quiet in this prison. So it's a rather negative example, but it just shows how powerful this is. Now, according to Derrida, the ancient Greek concept of chorus is a kind of hybrid being, a playful liminal phenomena that cannot be represented, for example, using the space of a map. For him, the ordered polysemy, meaning many meanings of the word, chorus, always includes the sense of political place, or more generally of invested place, by opposition to abstract space, for example, of location on a map. Chorus means place occupied by someone, country, inhabited place, territory, or region. Chorus is a political landscape made of such places. And I think that it's important to think about that these meetings, these thing meetings, for example, or the meetings at the Acropolis, the meetings of the people at these kinds of things, wasn't just all about being serious. They also had plays, they had sports. And also, as I was showing you at the example from the university, how you have students playing sports at one point, and you have students demonstrating at another point. So it's a kind of playful thing. It's not play around with ideas. And there's a Dutch historian named Huizinga that wrote a book called Homo Ludens, where he traces our political institutions and so on back to play. So when you're playing soccer or something, don't think you're not being serious because it's the basis of all culture. Might be a comfort. I don't know. So it meant kind of landscape or land in an ancient Greek. A chorus for the Greeks was first and foremost a polis, with its political and cultural focus on the things that took place or occurred in the chorus, of the commonplace of the agora, where an aggregate of gregarious people assembled, also called agora, in order to carry out a discourse, also called agora. In modern Greek, it's often the name of an island's primary city. So this is an agora. People would meet. It was together and discuss things as they did on the plinks. And the word for the people is the agora. So you would be the agora. And if we have a discussion afterwards, the discussion is the agora. And what we agree upon is the agora. And this room is the agora. Chorus land, however, was not simply a single place, topos, but a landscape shaped of the topoi of varying places. The agora and its equivalents are not just the core of an urban area, but of the landscape polities that encompass both the urban and the rural. The landscape is the context for buildings, the chorus where they take place. not a scenic background for buildings. And so here you can see in Bruegel's painting, you have a little village where they have a green where they might meet and discuss things. But you also have way off in the distance a big city where they would do the same thing. So it's a kind of layered landscape of things. The ancient Greek agora and its later equivalents, for example, a town or a village square, played a similar role as the rural and urban commons, plaza, place, square, as a place where they met to discuss things, but also to play or put on a play as the core of a landscape, or the res publica. Now, the name of the commonplace chorus of the agora suggests an origin as a pastoral commons. Now, we know what commons is now. You know what pastoral is. Yes, pastore, that sort of thing. And the etymology of agora in Latin is the gregarious. Gregarious means talkative and so on. Of relating to a herd or flock, from greg, herd, or the Greek agiron, to collect, to assemble. And I read this yesterday, but this, some of you probably weren't here. So this is a cartoon from the New Yorker where you see two sheep talking. I think many of you have heard them go bah, bah, and you wonder what they're saying. But this man knew how to interpret it. And what this sheep is saying to this one is, sure, I follow the herd, not out of brainless obedience, mind you, but out of a deep and abiding respect for the concept of community. So for me, I've got interested, and I'll talk about this later today, but I've gotten interested in just why sheep? What is it about sheep? And one of the things that interests me about Mexico is that before the conquest, there were no sheep. And I also should point out that sheep in small herds belonging to small farmers is one thing. Sheep in huge herds belonging to big rancheros or whatever is another thing. So big herds of sheep is a very dictatorial kind of thing, whereas small herds of sheep is a rather democratic kind of thing. So I think maybe once you got sheep in Mexico, maybe they were large herds of sheep. I don't know rather than. But in any case, you did not have these sheep before the Spanish came. But when the Spanish came, they brought sheep, but they also brought a religion that is where the symbol of the sheep is very, very important. Jesus was the Lamb of God. So that's one of my questions. But to show how this sheep plays a role in European history, the most famous poet that England ever produced was named William Wordsworth. And he lived in the Lake District, which was a very pastoral area way up here. And he saw this pastoral area as being very different from London. For one thing, it was a more egalitarian kind of place where people had a strong sense of community as opposed to London. So he called this area the Lakes, and even though it was officially part of the British state, he famously identified it as a commonwealth and as a republic, res publica, a republic of shepherds and agriculturalists, because it was known for its relatively egalitarian community of commoners and the concomitant sense of neighborliness, place identity, and environmental consciousness, compared with the more hierarchically and centrally, spatially organized areas near London. Subsequently, it was here that the environmental movement had an initial home. This notion of shepherds res publica might have had something to do with the hefting of sheep and people. I'll explain what hefting means in a minute. So it's also interesting that the English environmental movement, and thereby a large part of the world environmental movement, started in this area. It was people like Wordsworth and his friends and people later who created the environmental movement because they believed in this sharing of people and animals and creating an ideal environment. So, and also, a lot of people today think of nature as wilderness, but it wasn't wilderness. It was a nature that people share. Now, Foucault, writing actually about this pastoral tradition in Christianity, says that the shepherd's power is not exercised over a territory, but by definition over a flock, and more exactly, over the flock in its movement from one place to another. So in contrast with the power exercised on the unity of a territory, for example, by the state, pastoral power is exercised on a multiplicity on the move. So pastoral power, you have to be able to get this flock moving in the same direction. And this poor chap is trying to get this whole flock through the center of a town. It was quite, and they suddenly went off in the wrong direction, and it was quite hysterical. Foucault, by the way, this is one of the last things he wrote, and it was some lectures that he gave. And he had a terrible cold. If you've ever given a lecture with a terrible cold. So he kind of collapsed in the middle of it. So you can, if you want to finish this, pick up that you can continue with Foucault's ideas. He never did himself. And this neighborliness also is related to the fact that when you have a commons, up on the commons, there are no walls. They're not allowed to have walls. They're not allowed to have fences. So your sheep, I'll get into this, tend to stick together, but if they don't, it's good to be on good terms with your neighbor so that the neighbor doesn't slaughter your sheep and put it in their freezer, but gives it back to you. It's sort of thing that's kind of practical. So in the Lake District and the Scottish borderlands, the sheep are said to heft on or bond themselves to various pastures in the land. The sheep become attached to particular pastures through familiarity. By extension, it also becomes the shepherd's heft, and the term the shepherds use to describe their own feeling of belonging. So this farmer's sheep, which happen to have blue paint on their sides, heft over here, and another farmer's heft over here. There's no fences, and they can cross that stream, but they tend to stick together and divide up the pastures amongst themselves. If there's a drought and there's not so much forage, they will go together and share what there is. And this tends to be true of pastoral societies. They will get together and share stuff if there's a problem. And so this word heft, though, is interesting because this is an area settled by Scandinavians. And in the Scandinavian language today, the word heft is a key word in customary law. It's a kind of foundational law concept in customary law. It means precedence, basically. If your sheep have been here for 20 years, you have precedence on allowing your sheep to be there the next 20 years or longer. So you have a hefted right to do that. And it's the same, and so it's a basic concept. So heft comes from the Old Norse hefte, meaning to keep up, as with the holding of an old custom, but also in the sense of maintenance, by which one both maintains a path through walking or a pasture through use and not abuse, and one maintains the right to do so. The maintenance of such a use, in turn, connected to the meaning of heft as a prescriptive, customary use right based on precedence. So you've all probably walked on a path at some point through a field, and maybe it connects two places, two villages or something. And if you walk on the path, you'll see that you maintain the path. You can see that people are walking on it. If people stop walking on it, then the grass will grow up and you will lose the path. And so in Britain to this day, or at least in England to this day, you maintain the right to walk on that path as long as you can see that it's been walked on. And so there are groups of people who go regularly, go once a year or more, walking on certain paths to continue that right to walk there. And that gives them a hefted right. Well, the sheep do more or less the same things. In fact, they create paths, but they also graze the grass. And the thing about it is if you don't graze the grass, well, any of you grow up with a lawn? Know about lawns? If you don't mow your lawn, what happens? It gets very high and then it gets scraggly. And if you don't do it long enough, trees will start coming up, bushes will start coming up, weeds will start coming up. So in order for a pasture to stay a pasture, it has to be grazed, not overgrazed and not undergrazed. So it's a symbol in a way of good maintenance. And by maintaining it well, you maintain the right to continue using it. So here, this is bad weather. Geographers have to go through tough things. I rode up there on a three-wheeled motorbike through this horrible weather. And when we went there, they didn't tell us it was the rainiest place in all of England. But anyway, it's really bad weather, and the red sheep and the green and the blue sheep are together. But normally they would keep apart. This is just an example from Faroe Islands, where we were not too long ago. The structure here is common also for England, and it's the people in the Lake District may have come from here. So here you have the village, you have the recently enclosed infields where they cultivate potatoes, basically, because nothing else will grow there. It rains most of the time, I think. It never gets cold and it never gets hot because it's in the middle of the Atlantic. And out beyond, you have the commons. And each section of the commons is hefted and shared by a Faroese feilagi, as it's called. And each commoner has a share of the flock, which in turn is hefted on a given pasture. So this is another section of the commons hefted and shared by a Faroese feilagi and managed by a common shepherd. The flock is divided several times a year in order to determine, for example, which lambs are fit to pasture the undivided upland commons and those which need to be pastured for a while on the lowland, undivided common meadowland. The flock is divided for pasturing and breeding, not the land. The continuity of the flock and the family is critical. So this is the thing about the flock, is that these families are very proud of the breeding stock of the flock. And they're very proud that they have competitions and they see who has the best sheep. And the continuity is very important to the family. So the sheep are almost part of the family, and the children get a certain portion of the flock and grow up with them. And so the word sacrifice, they do have to kill the sheep, stay alive, but it's almost like a sacrifice of a member of the family. So this Jesus as the sacrificial lamb is somehow related to that. So here we have a Dorothy as a young girl with her prize-winning sheep, and here we have her dividing the flock, but not the land. The flock is the important thing. Now this is this one was actually in the Lake District. This one we're back on well, no, this is the Lake District. This is the Faroese Islands, and the feilagi. This is part of the feilagi in this particular community. And it just so happened our minister of Statsminister, Minister of State, the president of Denmark is married to a Faroese, and so he's a member of the feilagi. This is him right here. This is when he sneaks off there to get away, and the head of, and he's a horrible person, but when he's there, he's okay. So this gives you an idea of the word feilagi. The word fellow comes, which is an English word, of course, but fellow comes from the Old Norse feilagi, from fe meaning sheep or cattle, and lagi meaning ordering, putting in place, herding. So the fellowship of the community, which is this in Spanish, unfortunately it's not the same word, but you get the idea. The sharing of something gives the word fellowship, and this is an important word for Christianity. So this is a fellowship, you could say. And here we have Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. Stephen Gudeman, who is an anthropologist who has done work in Central America, he says that commons is a shared interest or value. It is the patrimony or legacy of a community and refers to anything that contributes to the material and social sustenance of a people with a shared identity, land, buildings, seed stock, knowledge of practices, a transportation network, an educational system, or rituals. It doesn't mention sheep. I wrote to him about this and asked him, and he said, well, he never thought to think about sheep. And what we have this notion that is tied to landscape, this notion of sharing. And in Europe, we have the European Landscape Convention, and you might want to make a similar convention for Central America or South Latin America. Landscape is an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. Landscape is the place of a people in polity, and therefore states should recognize landscapes in law as an essential component of people's surroundings, an expression of the diversity of their shared cultural and natural heritage, and a foundation of their identity. You should notice that it's both natural and human, but it's seen from the human point of view. So this is not a landscape of wilderness. This is a landscape created by our So Gudeman goes on, the commons is the material thing or knowledge that people have in common. And I'm wondering what that material thing is here, what they share. So what happens to a commons is not a physical incident, but a social event. It is therefore that taking away the commons destroys community, and destroying a complex of relationships demolishes the commons. The commons somehow or other is key to society. This is a drawing from 1700s where a manor owner enclosed the commons with a fence. But on Rogation Day, the priest leads the parishioners, the commoners, as they're called, and they tear down the fence. But here you see this, the people rising up to maintain the commons, much as you rise up to use your commons here at the university to play soccer or whatever. So I have questions. Do sheep play a similar role in modern Mexican culture? I did find a picture of sheep under a Christmas tree in Morelia, but I wonder how many ordinary Mexicans would have that. So I ask, is it maize or other plants that play that role today? I have an impression that people are very proud of their maize is very genetically complex, so it can be very different from valley to valley or place to place, and they may be very proud of the seeds that they produced, and of course you see pictures of corn everywhere, you'd expect sheep, so maybe that's it. Also, this kind of genetic continuity. And this is you can't see it too well, I guess, but this is from San Diego, where Mexican immigrants they've made a Chicano park, and they're planning to take over California for Mexico. And they have a corn, maize, as a symbol of their community. It's a community park. Part two is the landscape of scenic space and property. So this is what happens when you think of landscape in terms of property demarcated on a map. The Renaissance rediscovery of Ptolemy's cartography was linked to a Platonic mode of thought in which the eye was seen to be the vehicle through which ideas expressing underlying, invisible, God-given Euclidean geometric laws of nature and the heavens was conveyed to humankind. So Plato believed that geometry was the primary reality. And the rest of us, we live in a cave and only kind of perceive fake reality. The real reality is the geometry. That's the archetypal reality. And this led to a renaissance of ancient ideas when they rediscovered, Ptolemy's in the Renaissance rediscovery of Ptolemy led to a whole renaissance of ideas, of Platonic ideas related to the map and to globes, where you could see in the map a kind of Platonic underlining structure. And this goes back to the idea of the priest Rex, the sorcerer king, controlling things by his knowledge of the heavenly bodies. You can see this guy here, and he has a caliper. And this is Ptolemy making his globe. So when Columbus came over here, he was using a Ptolemy globe to get here. Unfortunately, Ptolemy made a mistake. He made his globe too small. So Columbus thought it would just be easy to get here, but it wasn't. It was hard to get here. So anyway, so the idea is that he creates this globe using the lines of latitude and longitude, which are, of course, in geometry invisible. Have you ever seen a line of latitude or longitude? But they're on the globe, and we all believe in globes. We talk about globalism. You've got to be global here, don't you? You're all global, yeah. So anyway, the heavenly bodies were visible around, but the globe with metric structure is invisible. And this has to do with, unfortunately, you don't have this word in Spanish, but we have rulers. So this guy is a ruler. The state rules. And that comes actually from this. This is called a ruler in English. And the ruler rules using lines and drawing things on maps and so on. And so he's using a caliper, but he could as well be using a ruler. And it comes from the Latin regula, regent, straight edge, rule from regere, and so on. Here you see a French king mapped to rule Paris. The French also tried to rule Mexico, so you know about them. Here again, I wonder if the built the pyramids and so on were also rulers in this sense. They were very astronomically oriented and so on. The centralizing, bureaucratizing, absolutizing, and colonizing European Renaissance state worked to enclose the land within regular geometric, cartographic, spatial boundaries in order to foster the production, taxation, and regulation of the production of standardized commodities for a money economy. So this is what happens in the Renaissance. They're turning things into money. They want to make property out of things, and they want to have the state as something nicely bounded on a map. So today, people kill because of the boundaries on a map. And certain presidential candidates in America want to build walls along certain boundaries on the map, for example. He doesn't know about people tunneling under walls. He hasn't kept up, really. But anyway. And in this way, governments and wealthy individuals began to privatize and alienate common lands regulated by customary use and transform them into territorial states and estates governed by statutory property rights. The Ptolemaic map not only facilitated the division of the land into regular measurable properties, its underlying grid was experienced as representing an underlying and abstract, ideal, utopian, uniform, geometric, spatial unity by which the abstract exchange value of the property could be measured. So basically what they did was, this would be kind of common lands. They saw this structure underneath, and they create this pattern of framed space of the map to enclose states, but also to enclose properties. And it's also related to money, because commons you can't sell. You don't own anything to sell. You only have a right to use it. Once you privatize it, once you enclose it, then you can sell it and it becomes a commodity. A uniform commodity, you buy so many square feet. So these lines are invisible. They measure abstract geometrical space and clock time. This is also a clock. Whereas this guy is making a visible representation of time. And it's much more accurate. This time is much more accurate than the time on your watch. And so what you see is that these invisible lines then are turned into visible lines in our landscape. From Alice in Wonderland, by the way. This is a Swedish 20 crown note where you can see the property and it's also money. And the discovery of the Ptolemaic globe inspired Columbus, as I said. And it was really kind of amazing. You could go out into this big ocean, and with a compass and a sextant, you could figure out how to cross this huge ocean and find Mexico. That's what he really was looking for, right? And here he is. So the invisible lines were made visible as far as the conquistadors were. And these techniques also provided a means of representing the land as scenic landscape with the same abstract absolute space in the map, in which the field of place as chorus is reduced to location in scenic space. And so you see this artist here showing how the map turns into a perspectival drawing. Here you see someone using the same lines of longitude and latitude to create a landscape drawing. You see the same thing here. So by using this, basically, I think the best way to explain is if you have a Google Earth, Google is everywhere, right? You all have Google Earth, and it has you. You didn't know that. Yeah, I went on a line this morning, and it said, you can buy this in Mexico. Google knew I was in Mexico. I didn't tell them that. But anyway, if you look down on it and you tilt it up, you get a kind of landscape representation. But it's the same space, but it just looks three-dimensional, but it isn't three-dimensional. It looks three-dimensional. And the first time this one of the first times this word landscape was used to mean scenery, which is the most common meaning today, was around the time of 1605. And this was one of the first times in this play where Ben Jonson writes, for the scene was drawn a landskap, which falling an artificial sea was seen to shoot forth as it flowed to the land, raised with waves which seemed to move and in some places billow and break, as imitating that orderly disorder which is common in nature. so much for the bodily part, which was of Master Inigo Jones' design and act. So this was, he's describing the first use of perspective to create a scenic illusion on the stage, and he calls it a landscape. And so what he did was he creates this kind of perspectival space. This is the landscape. This is the king, the head of state, King James. Don't know about King James, but if you're a Protestant, his Bible is sort of the Bible, but you don't. Bible, I don't suppose, no. But anyway, this is the bodily part. And that was his wife, the Queen Anne from Denmark, and she was 6 months pregnant, so it was really a bodily part that he was showing. So what you get then is the invisible lines are being made visible. But in fact, the 3 dimensions is an illusion. So the invisible is made visible as an illusion. You think you're seeing something visible, but it's not. Being fooled. And this happened then with landscape architecture. So when they enclosed the commons, a lot of the British nobility or rich people who bought the land, who enclosed it and turned it into private property, they created landscape gardens around the property that looked like a pastoral landscape. But they weren't really, because if anybody this was a commons, if any of the villagers who went there, they could get hanged for going there. So it wasn't a commons anymore. It was very private, but it was a private commons. And here in this ditch, they have a fence, but you can't see the fence because it's in a ditch, because it's supposed to look like a commons. But if you get to the edge and look down, you'll go, aha, to the fence. And that device is called an aha for that reason. But it's a way of creating an illusion of a commons. And the same thing is true here. You see this space apparently has been enclosed and privatized by a Spanish settler. So it looks real and visible, but it's this invisible space that's being applied. Comes property. These people, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. Before there was perspectival representation, things were represented like this, which doesn't look real to you anymore. It looks crazy because you're used to perspective. But in fact, if you're ever walking through Siena and you get lost and you have heavy suitcases or a heavy book someone has given you or something like that, this looks actually what it's like, what you'd experience turning through the space. So it's much more realistic than a perspectival drawing. And I would say the same thing is true of some of the illustrative materials you found here, that they're not using perspective or so on because they're representing the world as they used it as a kind of customary use. So here you see the older way of doing it before perspective, and here's what happens with perspective. And of course, this is in the Vatican of all places, but it kind of gives you control of God, the control of the Vatican. It's all a controlled space. And actually, this painting here is being made from somebody looking this way. It looks right from that perspective, but if you move off to the side, it looks all wrong. Try going to a theater, a theater place with perspectival representation, and buy a cheap seat off on the side. Everything looks wrong. That's why people pay for expensive seats in the middle. And of course, the colonial state applied this kind of structure everywhere they went. And I'm pretty sure that the people who were there did not. And another interesting thing that an English scholar named John Barrow wrote a book called The Dark Side of the Landscape. And it's characteristic of these kinds of paintings that the native people, the people doing the work, not the property owners, are in the dark. Everywhere you look, even in England, they're always in the dark. The light is on the property, on the landscape as scenery. The native people are in the dark. Tim Ingold, an anthropologist in England, that's Tim there. Recognize him. But he's on a commons right there. And he wrote the following. There is a particular logic that has a central place in the structure of modern thought. I call this the logic of inversion. What it does in a nutshell is to turn the pathways along which life is lived into boundaries within which it is enclosed. Life, according to this logic, is reduced to an internal property of things that occupy the world but do not, strictly speaking, inhabit it. A world that is occupied but not inhabited, that is filled with existing things rather than woven from the strands of their coming into being, is a world of space. But this is what you might say that the conquistadors did to Mexico. Yeah. And that's the end.